Ever wondered what you'd do if you discovered someone built their dream home on your land while you were halfway around the world? I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it all started on a gloomy Tuesday. I had just spent a whirlwind month overseas in Japan, fully immersed in work and culture, when an unexpected letter arrived. It was stamped with an official seal and carried the weight of my past, a deed to 10 acres of secluded woodland left to me by my late grandfather. I'd heard stories about that land, the magical, mysterious place where I'd spent sunlit summers chasing fireflies and building forts, but I never imagined it would become the battleground of a modern-day David versus Goliath story. My journey home was filled with a mix of nostalgia and excitement. The drive through the countryside was picturesque, with endless stretches of green, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited. As I neared the property, a weathered sign, handwritten in my grandfather's unmistakable scrawl, welcomed me, private property. I felt a thrill of recognition, mixed with a hint of unease. Winding down a gravel path through thick trees, I arrived at a clearing that should have been a quiet retreat into nature. Instead, I noticed the glimmer of manicured lawns and the towering silhouettes of modern houses. It turned out that my little patch of land bordered an upscale community called Maple Ridge Heights, a place where power and prestige reigned. Not long after, I met an elderly local who hesitantly warned me about Karen Thompson, the HOA's iron-fisted vice president. According to him, Karen had long set her sights on the precious piece of land that bordered her immaculate backyard. "She's got her eye on your land," he whispered, his voice trembling with the gravity of his words. I didn't fully grasp it at the time, but little did I know that my inheritance was about to become the center of a bitter property dispute. While I was still in Japan, my property was managed by a local company I trusted to keep an eye on things. But trust, as I was about to learn, is a fragile thing. I began receiving fragmented updates, an unusual amount of construction noise at odd hours, and reports of unfamiliar figures roaming the edges of my woodland. I dismissed it as minor maintenance until a friend informed me that Karen had actually moved the boundary markers about 200 feet into my property and had already begun building something that looked far too luxurious to be on what I considered wild land. It wasn't just any structure, it was Karen's dream mansion, complete with grand columns, a sweeping driveway filled with luxury cars, and every sign pointing to the fact that it wasn't meant for my eyes. The HOA president, Richard Hammond, called it a reassessment of the property, one that allegedly placed my land into their domain. My heart sank as I realized that while I was halfway around the globe, my grandfather's legacy was being trampled by a powerful group that claimed to know best. Returning home felt like stepping into a nightmare. I immediately hired a trusted surveyor to assess the situation. The surveyor's report confirmed my worst fears. The boundary markers had been surreptitiously shifted, and the documents provided by the HOA were filled with inconsistencies. In fact, there were even hints of forgery, documents that bore the signature of my late grandfather, signed long after he'd passed. It was as if the HOA had orchestrated a grand heist, moving pieces on a chessboard without any regard for justice or truth. I confronted Karen and Richard with the evidence, but they dismissed my concerns with a blend of condescension and legal jargon. Their response was simple: anyone can hire a surveyor to say what they want. But this wasn't just about a misinterpretation of land boundaries, it was a deliberate act of deception. The HOA had falsified property lines, turning a piece of wild, cherished land into a commodity for their selfish ambitions. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, a twist emerged from the dusty pages of my grandfather's past. In a quiet corner of the county records, I discovered a clause that he had cleverly woven into his property deed. He had sold the electrical easement rights to Maple Ridge Heights, but with a crucial stipulation. The easement rights were not to be transferred or altered without his explicit and legally binding approval. This was my grandfather's final gift, a safeguard to ensure that his beloved woodland would not be exploited. It was an ingenious loophole. While the HOA had the land, they depended on a consistent supply of electricity to power their lavish lifestyles and opulent mansions. In a bold move that would redefine the power dynamics of Maple Ridge Heights, I decided to buy back those rights. I spent every penny of my savings and all the time I had left negotiating with the local power company until I held in my hands the legal authority to disconnect power to the very community that had stolen my heritage. The day of reckoning arrived on a brisk Monday morning. At a lavish housewarming party thrown by Karen, where guests mingled and admired the splendor of her new home, I made my move. With a calm yet determined presence, I stepped into the spotlight and announced that I owned the electrical easement rights. The room fell silent. Faces that had earlier radiated confidence now turned pale as the realization set in. They were at my mercy. I explained, in no uncertain terms, that I had every right to cut off their electricity, a move that would plunge the entire community into darkness if they failed to resolve the property dispute. Calls from angry HOA lawyers and frantic settlement offers flooded in, but I was resolute. This wasn't about money, it was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine and upholding the legacy of my grandfather. That very afternoon, maintenance trucks began arriving at strategic points around Maple Ridge Heights. As I watched from a distance, their lights flickered ominously, a promise of the impending blackout. It wasn't a reckless threat, it was a calculated move backed by ironclad legal documentation and the power of property law. What followed was not just a legal battle, but a transformation within the community. The residents, tired of the HOA's autocratic rule and questionable tactics, began to rally around my cause. At an emergency town hall meeting, voices that had long been silenced by fear and intimidation spoke up. Eleanor Winters, a respected longtime resident, took the microphone and proposed an alternative solution that would benefit everyone, a compromise that respected property rights and ensured accountability within the HOA. Under intense public pressure, Karen and Richard were forced into negotiations. The terms were simple: an immediate dismantling of the mansion built on my land, the restoration of permanent and unmovable boundary markers, and a public apology acknowledging the injustice. Reluctantly, and with heavy hearts, the HOA board agreed. Over the next few days, work crews began the careful process of dismantling the structure piece by piece. Each item was cataloged for reuse, a silent testament to the fact that nothing built on stolen land could ever replace what was rightfully earned. Standing on my porch, watching the once vibrant mansion slowly come apart, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey. It wasn't just a story about reclaiming property. It was a story about standing up for what is right, about challenging authority with knowledge and patience, and about the enduring power of legacy. I later sold the electrical easement rights back to the community at cost, but with one binding condition: a portion of all future HOA fees would be dedicated to local land conservation. This condition wasn't just a financial decision, it was a promise to preserve the natural beauty and history of the land for generations to come. Years later, as I sit in my cozy home surrounded by restored trees and flourishing wildflowers, I often share this tale with friends and family. I remind them that we are all just temporary custodians of this earth, a reminder that even when injustice seems insurmountable, there is always a way to reclaim what truly matters. My grandfather once told me, "We don't own the land, we borrow it for a while." And in reclaiming my land, I realized that sometimes the greatest power lies not in wealth or influence, but in standing firm and fighting for justice.